of a companion. And whenever there is weakness in the chain of the transmission of the hadith, I have put all of my efforts into examining and finding proofs for authenticating it in an abbreviated manner. This effort is something that one does not see jurists capable of doing nowadays, or even interested in doing so. If you consider this book of mine, you will see that it is the very best of its age. Typical Suyuti statement from the 15th century. Reflecting on this passage from Suyuti, Sheikh Muhammad suggests that this effort on the part of the 15th century author indicates a depth of understanding of the textual tradition that is neglected by so many so-called scholars today. Sheikh Muhammad then makes a point of mentioning that to acquire the knowledge and skills necessary to understand universal principles and to make connections between different disciplines, as the Suyuti did in his time, requires the guidance of a teacher. It is a great responsibility of those associated with the ancient institution of Al-Azhar to pass on this legacy to future generations of students, so that these sciences will not be lost or corrupted. Like Muhammad Wissam, the third commentator, Sheikh Amr Wadani, is from a younger generation of scholars who count Sheikh Ali Goma among their mentors. And I should mention that I studied with Sheikh Amr on more than one occasion, so there is a personal angle to this as well. The younger scholars are both seen in the videos of Sheikh Ali's lessons, suggesting that they thought it necessary to show support for their mentor at a very sensitive time, just before the election of Morsi and Sheikh Ali's retirement as state mufti. Sheikh Ahmed's series on Suyuti's Ashbat is the longest of the three commentaries, and like the other two scholars, his focus is on methodology and pedagogy. He sees Suyuti's Ashbat less as a book of fiqh and more as a guide to the exercise of doing fiqh, in the sense of understanding a problem and using sources to derive a solution through abstraction and deduction. The ultimate goal of this process on the part of the jurist is ijtihad, much as it was for Suyuti himself. Suyuti's Ashbat illustrates for the student how complex issues in jurisprudence can be boiled down to their essence, the separate components separated and abstracted into universals, and then reapplied to a new context. As the Suyuti argues, the study of likenesses and similarities provides the jurist with the tools not only to comprehend the issue, but then to translate that comprehension into action, meaning the ability to derive rulings in cases where there is no clear textual precedent. Therefore, the statement, jurisprudence is the knowledge of likenesses, suggests that the larger purposes and rationales underlying the principles of fiqh are more important than the literal meaning of specific regulations. Sheikh Amr reminds his followers that the technical processes that the mufti undertakes to find a ruling based on textual evidence in analogous cases are also ethical in nature. Although Sheikh Amr does not identify this worldview as belonging to a Sufi model of behavior in his commentary, his portrayal of the ethics of compassion behind dry legal precepts fits in well with the Sufi part of the Azhari Manhaj. The Sufi part of the Manhaj that the three scholars are trying to promote is described less as a matter of doctrine and more along the lines of an attitude or an ethical code of conduct. In Sheikh Muhammad's view, for example, a superficial takfiri approach assumes people to be in a state of unbelief or sinfulness, whereas in his view, the moderate and wasati approach, the default is to treat all human beings with respect and to give people the benefit of the doubt. If someone has engaged in a sinful act but still considers him or herself to be Muslim, it is cruel and unfair to condemn that person as an apostate, especially since ultimately only God knows the true intention in someone's heart and mind. For Sheikh Muhammad, the qawaid are rules to live by, in the sense that they do not represent just abstract principles confined to the realm of legal methodology, but if internalized properly, give one a complete worldview or framework with which to live one's life, what he calls manhaj al-hayat. Similar to Sheikh Muhammad's appeal to his students to internalize the qawaid as a framework for living and interacting with others, Sheikh Amr talks about a civilizational method, a manhaj umrani, that draws on Sharia principles to improve the lives of human beings in society. Drawing inspiration from the great historian Ibn Khaldun, Sheikh Amr advocates a God-centered approach to the study of human history and society. He contrasts the desired manhaj umrani with what he sees as a materialist Western approach to social science that begins and ends with issues of power and control. Sheikh Amr argues that While the two methodologies deploy similar concepts, the fundamental assumption of the so-called Western approach is that human beings are ultimately the masters of their own environment, and that the end goal is to dominate the production of meaning in society, whereas Muslims should strive to build up and enrich civilization as servants of God. To conclude, in their efforts to promote a centrist methodology and to discredit what is portrayed as an antithetical approach espoused by extreme Salafis and secularists, Azhari scholars have focused on what they do best: interpreting the texts that make up the rich cultural and intellectual heritage of Muslims, particularly in the context of Islamic jurisprudence. Although it may seem that they're doing what they've always done, the difference is that at a time of crisis, the task takes on a greater sense of urgency, and the stakes seem higher than ever before. While challenges to the authority of the traditionally trained ulama are certainly nothing new, the response has been more systematic and media savvy than in the past. Not only do we see Azhari scholars arguing for a methodology, we see them actually putting it into practice. 5 years after the January 25th revolution, and with Egypt's future still very much uncertain, it remains to be seen whether the efforts of Al-Azhar's leadership to reinvent themselves as a true moral conscience of the nation will succeed, or if it will be too little, too late. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you very much. Now, I'd just like to make a couple of housekeeping announcements. First of all, the fire alarm is going to ring very soon. Please do not be disturbed. Okay, I think that might be the end of it. The other thing is that after this session there will be a concluding set of discussion in the 2.1, the main hall, so please make sure that you join us there. And finally, we'd just like you to make sure that you fill in the evaluation form, because the conference organisers are looking for feedback. And also we request that you leave your evaluation form and your name badge in the box near the lift, if you wouldn't mind. So thank you very much for that. And having done my housekeeping and thanking Rebecca very much for her very thoughtful presentation, I'd like to invite Kimani to come and speak to us about Islamic-inspired radio stations in Kenya, something I'm extremely interested to hear about. So thank you, Kimani.
Oh, thank you. So we've listened to quite a bit of Egypt and a few other countries, but we haven't heard from East Africa. We've also listened quite a bit about other media and very little about radio. So I think that it may very well be the case that I have to take this responsibility of talking about radio, which is really critical. Just also to indicate that this is a new area for me, in the sense that I've been working much more with identity and within ethnic identity, media governance, and so on. But as we worked on the construction of identities in Africa, in our book Construction of Media and Identities with the late John Middleton, I became quite interested in issues of marginalization and exclusion. Now let me indicate that most of the Muslims actually live on the coast as well as northeastern Kenya. So most of the work that we're doing relates to these particular areas. You'll still find quite a number of Muslims across the country, but the majority live on the coast as well as northeastern Kenya, mainly Somali as well as the Swahili and related communities on the East African, on the Kenyan coast. Now, I really think it's important to understand the context for radio, and that context can be linked to literacy levels. Now, the two areas where you find majority Muslims are also the regions with the lowest levels of literacy nationally. And really, if you look at 75% of women in northeastern Kenya having absolutely no literacy. So you would not expect them to go online. Equally at the coast, very small percentage, I don't have the numbers, but they are there in the Kenya National Demographic and Health Service. And we know that access to media is pegged on literacy. So people with higher literacy are likely to access television. People with less literacy are likely to access radio and so on. So there is that connection. And the fact that radio is almost an extension, really, of oral communication makes a lot of sense. And therefore, for us, it seems as if the way identities are being constructed amongst Muslims, and actually also being contested is through radio. No respecter of territorial boundaries. I mean, if you look at the most received broadcaster in Eastern Africa, it's actually BBC. Very, 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 very respected. All you require is language and signal. The mobile phone, with a high penetration rate in Kenya at 65%, is still quite unavailable in certain parts of the country, especially northeastern Kenya. You still need to climb a mountain to be able to get a signal, or climb a tree to pick a signal. For the pastoral communities, the Muslim, the Somali community, the radio makes a lot of sense. Equally for the fishing community, the Swahili, because you can actually have the radio on your boat, and as you fish, as you do all sorts of things, so it makes a lot of sense. Therefore, radio as the main medium for accessing information, education, and entertainment, and so on. The beginnings. I think it is critically important that I draw your attention to the first, radio station at the coast, and how, Suyuti and Vita, and how it came into being. 1947 makes a lot of sense. End of Second World War, the independence struggle across Africa just emerging. India, broadcasting from All India Radio. We were also receiving broadcasts from Radio Madras, and quite a number of other signals coming about liberation. And around 1952, the Kenyan Mau Mau emergency. Therefore, how do you secure the coast? How do you ensure that it's not as radicalized? But even much more important is that it was set up to articulate and defend coastal values through the valorization of the Kimvita dialect. The Kimvita dialect is actually the dialect spoken in Mombasa. It's one of the dialects of Swahili. And of course, celebration of Arab and Swahili virtues, entrenching Muslim sensibility, according to Brennan. For those of, I think that Professor Farouk is aware of the struggles between the Kiunguja dialect and the Kimvita dialect, and I'll be coming to that in a moment. So it is important to recall that the Kimvita dialect was the language spoken in Suyuti and Vita. And the fact that this radio station was part of a larger communication plan within the context of the Second World War, the struggle for independence in former colonies, and the dock workers' strike in Mombasa. Now, the 1947 dock workers' strike also set in motion another dock workers' strike in Unguja, in Zanzibar. The same time. So how do you contain these workers' agitation? You do it through a radio station. And of course, the station closed daily with the song "God Save the Queen." Really the celebration of Britain throughout. The construction of the colonial narrative, of course, was very, very important. And remember, the coast, very, very delicate, extremely delicate, as the port of entry into Kenya, into East Africa, very close to the Middle East, very, very connected in terms of community sensibility, and so on. Now, what's also very particular about the Kimvita dialect is its heaviness in terms of Arabic lexicon and Islamic diction. The contest between the Zanzibar dialect and the Kimvita dialect was precisely because of this. The Unguja dialect was less Arabized, less Islamized. I think in 1930s when the Interterritorial Language Committee sought to de-Arabize Kiswahili, they put in a lot of English into the Kiunguja dialect, and didn't interfere with the Kimvita dialect. So you have a lot of that. The contest in terms of popular culture appearing in the late 1950s, when there was a lot of rock and roll music in the Sauti Mvita, a lot of rock and roll. And I recall that the coastal community, the Mombasa community, was extremely unhappy with the rock and roll, although of course very, very popular among certain members of the audiences. They therefore petitioned banning of rock and roll and the playing of local poetry and Taarab music. Again, Taarab music linking East Africa with Egypt. Upcountry broadcasting, 1953, again at the peak of the Mau Mau struggle, the African Broadcasting Service getting established, broadcasting in a number of upcountry languages, Kiswahili, Doluo, Kikuyu, Kinandi, and so forth and so on. And the idea was to check the nationalistic fervor that was quickly gaining ground and using standardized Kiswahili, not the Kimvita dialect, because Kimvita dialect, heavy on Arabic, heavy on Islam. Therefore, drawing much more on the Zanzibari dialect. Then we move very quickly now, we transition to the, notice that in the 1950s, broadcasting was really a monopoly of the state, articulating a state narrative, articulating the colonial narrative, minimizing the voices of citizens and so on. Now this continues 1960s to 1980s, again monopoly of the state. You have the Voice of Kenya, you have the Kenya Broadcasting Corporation, you have really a singular voice. Therefore, the consequence of this is political opposition, academia, university students, and all sorts of people who are feeling a little stifled by state monopoly of media outlets, really coming up with alternative ways of articulating. And therefore, you have underground literature, Pambana, you have Mpatanishi, you have Beyond, you have Society, all sorts of literature coming from below. And of course you have music, subversive music, and so on. Now, we also at the time, of course, have lots and lots of pressure demanding broader inclusion in decision-making, accountability of public officials and so on. This is the period of Kenyatta. It's also the period of Daniel Arap Moi. We have a lot of Kenyans who go into exile, key writers, Ngugi wa Thiong'o being locked up, Abdulatif Abdallah, one of the foremost poets from Mombasa, writing an underground leaflet and then ending up in exile, in prison first, and then into the University of Dar es Salaam in exile, and then later to London. A lot of coastal people getting out of the country because of feeling stifled by the lack of voice. Now, then of course we have this growth in information technology, global events, and opening up of the democratic space. We pushed that through multi-party political participation, and the coast was really central in this. So you have the Islamic Party of Kenya, for example, which is not registered by the state because of its religious inclination. You have Sheikh, Balala, demonstrating and organizing in the streets. No media outlet for them. Now, really, I think what's absolutely critical is to recognize that media was critical in the democratization process, provided the avenue for democratization of this of the state and opening up of free press. But of course, once you open up that space, then you have a free media. So it created the impetus for opening up of space, and also benefited once that space became opened. So we see growth of radio broadcasting, we see growth of broadening of ownership of media, broadening of access, expansion of commercial radio, offering music, talk shows, and less news, almost as if one is talking about oralization of broadcast media. Licensing of non-profit community radio stations and so on, proliferation of religious-based broadcasters supported by donors, and entry of foreign stations. So Radio Tehran gets in, Radio China International gets in. You have a lot of other broadcasters getting into the country. So that the system is opening up internally, but also receiving from outside of Kenya. Now, naturally, we had, because of the opening up, we had to have radio stations inspired by Islam. Inspired by Islam as a religion, but they were not necessarily broadcasting only religious content for obvious reasons. And one would say that the dominant narrative, especially in the 1990s in Kenya, was the possibility that Islam was a violent religion. And that appeared to be the dominant in most of the mainstream media. Let me also say that this is also a time that Kenya starts experiencing, terrorism. 1998, with the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi, the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Dar es Salaam. And I must tell you that I was on the queue trying to get a visa in 1998 to go to the United States. So I was just outside when the damn thing exploded. But hey, I'm here. So it was real. It really was. It was the case that these things happened, and the Kenya government automatically reacted very, very pointedly, targeting young people, young Muslims. They didn't know where to go. They didn't know where to start. They knew you go to Isli, it seems like this is where they're organizing from. You go to Mombasa, you pick them up. And of course the United States also, supporting this type of approach. And then the possibility of religious and ethnic polarization and profiling, very, very real, Therefore, urgent need to present alternative narratives. So, currently we have 3 Islamic-inspired radio stations. We have Iqra FM, established in 2000, exactly 2 years after the bomb blast, really opening up of that station. Radio Rahma. Iqra FM started by Khalif Muhammad, and then later taken up by the Supreme Council of Kenya Muslims. Radio Rahma, owned by TSS, one of the rich guys in Mombasa. Radio Salam, again started in 2006, owned by the son of the late Sharif Nasir, a politician. And really, in my interviews with especially Iqra FM group, it seems as if the mandate is to entrench Muslim sensibilities in sound, voice, and schedule, online and offline. all these radio stations have a presence online. They are streamed live, they have Facebook accounts, and they have Twitter accounts. They reflect the needs of audiences, and we do have a lot of Christian radio stations, not less than 20, very, very many. So when one is looking at the Islamic inspired radio stations, you need to be able to see them within the context of other religions. So you have a lot of Christian stations articulating identity politics and the desire for recognition. The coast has always felt excluded politically, excluded economically and socially, stigmatized on account of history and so on. So we have quite a number of shows that are Islamic, Kisomo cha Quran, lessons in Quran, and so on, contests between the secular and the religion, and political commentary, quite a bit of that actually. Quite a bit of political commentary. In the morning drive shows like Tangalizi, Tatizo Liko Wapi, Where is the Problem, and so on. The interaction is in the form of SM, short message texting, as well as Facebook and Twitter. We have very active interactive women's program on leadership, marriage, health, family, and well-being. And we know from Alidu's research in Niger that these platforms are used to enhance women in leadership. In Niger, in Kenya, in a few other countries. Then we have constitutional and legal issues. One of the hosts is Ibrahim, who is a former commissioner with the Constitutional Review Commission in Kenya, and who is a real Islamic scholar. Language, of course, the fact that they broadcast in English, Kikuyu, and Luo. There is no other Islamic-inspired radio station, in my knowledge, that broadcasts in Kikuyu and Luo, the two highly politicized ethnic groups in Kenya. And one would need to ask the question: why are they broadcasting in this highly politicized, in the language of these highly politicized communities? It's because they would like to reach out to them. There are lessons in Arabic, and they're opening up debate within the Ummah, and really in a very delicate way. And let me just also mention here that they are interrogating power relations, they are articulating Islamic ideals and so on, but in a very, very delicate way, because according to the organizers, they do not want to be banned by the state. So balancing state concerns and interests of the Ummah, creating space for the Kenya Defense Forces, and so on, to articulate government position, but in a very, very delicate and balanced way. And they were very, very key in articulating a vision for the Kadhi courts in the Kenyan Constitution. Very, very important again for the stations. And the media platforms are being used to challenge power and deconstruct and reconstruct identities, reaching out as much as they can. They're also about stories of Muslims who protect Kenyans in the face of terrorism. There was this huge attack of a bus on the northeastern region, and the Muslim passengers stepped up and said, you can't kill our colleagues, you'll have to kill us first. So they protected their Christian colleagues, and that was covered very, very well in the Islamic-inspired radio stations. So it's really reaching out to wider communities and challenging the dominant narrative of Islam as inherently violent, and reaching out to people to say, there is a different way of understanding Islam. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Kimani for a fantastic paper, and now I'd like to invite Bastien to present his paper on Islamic State in the era of Clickbait. So I might get you to explain that a little bit further.
Yeah, I'll try to do that.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for being here, for choosing this session. I heard this was the party session. So
Absolutely.
And thank you to the organizers of the conference for inviting me. I think I learned a lot over the past few days, and some of the things that might be obvious to you actually found extremely interesting. Were not obvious to me because I'm an archaeologist, so I work mostly with people that have been dead for thousands of years. So public perception is a much more difficult concept there. So today I'm not going to talk exactly about the relationship between Islam and cultural heritage. Instead, I want to focus on how the media have represented that relationship and how it was received by the Western audience. And indeed, from Bamiyan in Afghanistan to Timbuktu to Palmyra to so many other places, we've seen that the past few decades have really contributed to shaping a rather negative image of the relationship between cultural heritage and Islam. And our memories are filled with pictures of smashed temples or flattened mausoleums or statues in museums destroyed with a hammer. And so that those iconoclastic events that are rather rare are not only seen as sort of a almost systematic expression of Islamic fundamentalism in countries at war, they also end up representing cultural destruction as a whole. But what's interesting is that the data shows that this type of ideologically motivated intentional destruction of cultural heritage is actually a fairly rare occurrence. It's far from constituting the majority of the destructions that are taking place. So we want to ask the question, why? What's the basis for our perception and what's the mechanisms behind it? So trying to leave some political discussions and agendas aside, I'll argue here, and it's a result of discussion that we had with Jason Fersch in the course of a conference at Harvard last year. I'll argue that one of the reasons behind this is this very fruitful relationship, very dynamic relationship between iconoclasm, such as it is practiced by Daesh in Iraq and Syria, for instance, and the modern media strategy of clickbait. So I look a little bit at those two aspects. I look at how they interstate around the destruction of cultural heritage, and then I'll present some examples of good practices and hopefully some ways forward. So tackling the question of iconoclasm, I'll use James Simpson, a historian. James Simpson's quotes on talking about the destruction in Syria. We've been here before, and we have been here before. Clearly, first evidence of iconoclastic urges go as far back as pharaonic Egypt, and it's faces of queens and kings chiseled off of temple columns and walls. This is an example in Karnak here. It's also destruction of destruction of statues during the Chaldeans reform. So this has been around for a long time, and the iconoclasm itself is really so it's first and foremost the annihilation of an idea, of a concept, through the destruction of its material representation. This can be done for various reasons. Often it's generally around religious and or political motives. But what is very interesting is that it's always a feature, a necessary feature in new, sort of a narrative of renaissance or revolutions. And in this construction of new narrative, one of the important aspects is that this destruction, this whole process needs to be seen, it needs to be staged, it needs to be witnessed. So not only do you need to have people witnessing your action, you need to see witnessing the result, right? The destroyed temple, the destroyed statue. You also need, it's even better if the public gets to witness the destruction process itself. So that fits pretty well in what we've seen happening in Iraq and in Mali and Yemen, and especially in Syria over the past few years. So just quickly, the destruction of cultural heritage in Syria can be sort of broken down into several categories. One is a military use, where you have military groups settling in various sites of cultural heritage importance. This was the case in Karnak, not Karnak, but Krak des Chevaliers, sorry. You also have collateral damage. This is a screenshot that I took 2 days ago of the argument on Syria that basically shows the two armies, the opposition and Bashar al-Assad here in Aleppo, and right here in the middle is the citadel of Aleppo, which is a World Heritage Site. There's obviously a lot of looting going on. This is what we've heard about a lot. This is the site of Bamia, again a screenshot that I took of the 2012 satellite picture. on Google Earth. Urban development is also extremely destructive. Well, this is actually an example from Baghdad, but I thought it was pretty obvious, and it's the American army settling in nicely in Babylon by digging trenches everywhere. And again, the ideologically motivated destruction, which is the one that we're going to talk about the most in here, the destruction of the shrine in the surroundings of Palmyra. So considering the diversity of destruction that taking place in Syria and Iraq, we're going to really focus on those two countries for now. I'm sure you realize that our attention is being almost disproportionately focused on this kind of ideologically motivated iconoclasm. So there's also a good reason for that. Is that the media team and strategy of ISIS or Daesh actually made pretty sure this was going to be the case. So this is the ISIS structure of its propaganda group. Basically, it's based on Winter's work for the Pullman Foundation, which is it dates a little bit, but it was pretty thorough. So what we see is it's an extremely sophisticated structure, organization, extremely complex machine with about 146 propaganda unit. That was a few years ago. It definitely changes a lot. And what we see is there's a strict hierarchy with some officers generally in charge of the media that are more paid than others because they're expected to bring in more recruits and more money. So this is also a sort of the production that's taking place. So they're in charge of producing a large amount of videos, of graphics, of radio recording as well, and are then largely diffused across the territory, generally to both legitimate the action but also carry out large-scale recruiting and proselytism. Is that a word in English, proselytism? It's close enough? Okay. The Washington Post did a lot of work as well at interviewing some of ISIS media team. And what we find out is rather interesting. What we see is the battle scenes and scenes of beheadings are properly staged, and that some of the fighters have to learn their lines with cue cards, performing multiple takes before you can actually get a good one. The report also shows that some of the battle scenes that we see on YouTube, for instance, generally take place in otherwise rather peaceful areas, just to make sure that you can get those multiple takes to find the good one. So what we see here is a carefully crafted sort of advertising campaign. And what this means for us is when we use those pictures, either as a group or individually on our Facebook newsfeed, for instance, we need to be aware of the context in which they were made. So going back just to ISIS and Syria, there's a shift that takes place in what's represented in their action. And generally it takes place, a shift from a representation of scenes of beheadings and mass killing, for instance, to scenes of cultural heritage destruction, which starts taking place generally, more or less with the destruction of the Mosul Museum in early 2015, then followed by Nineveh, followed by Palmyra, and a few others. And those are the pictures we're going to find on our Facebook and Twitter, and it is even more interesting since when you look at, again, coming from Winter's report, when you look at the type of events that's the narrative, the representation of narratives in the media events, so the production of ISIS, the production of brutality, which is where the destruction of cultural heritage takes place, is actually a smaller part, an extremely small portion of the overall production. So what this means to us is that we need to understand why this has been the most represented in the Western media. And one of the answers to that, one of them is the development of new economic models for the news, and especially the development of the clickbait. So clickbait is this viral sharing of pictures and ideas to convince people to click. It's a system where clicking generates revenue, and to some extent it also generates a sense of belonging to a community. It's the cute cat picture. It's the you'll never guess what happened next caption. And it's actually rather efficient. It's always very tempting. I mean, actually, I click on the 9 out of 10 Americans completely wrong about the mind-blowing facts, which I assume has to do with geography, as we said yesterday. So the strategy was really developed by Upworthy and BuzzFeed. And BuzzFeed started in 2006, which is really making cat videos, and eventually grew up to like 900 employees or something, and 10 bureaus around the world, and up to 18 million unique visitors. So the rise of the websites have an impact. They really influenced the sort of more old school, traditional news companies, such as the Washington Post, actually. And they started mirroring those practices because there's an economic model that makes it so that they need more revenues. And this shift has revealed extremely productive. So this model is not really going anywhere. And I think it's the idea is that it's an evolution that ISIS has been fairly aware of. And which is why the ISIS media team decided to redirect some of its production towards high quality videos and sleep magazine. This is an example of the Dabik, which is the publication of Daesh. It's available online, and it's both terrifying and entertaining. I don't actually have a word for that. But here's a picture, a cute cat picture again. So the idea is that the media team is keenly aware of its treatment, its perception in the Western media, so that it definitely adapts to optimize the impact of their message. Why this is relevant is, I mean, this is pretty obvious in the case of the Palmyra destruction. And let's say we can start with an assumption that, let's say, the worst case scenario, that the media attention did cause the destruction of Palmyra temples, which is an argument that you're going to hear here and there, which is obviously more complicated. But then you look at the Google trend for Palmyra and Islamic State, and what we find out is that after a series of published, really advertised beheadings, there's a decrease in ISIS headlines generation, so that news start refusing to publish just those gruesome pictures of beheadings and mass killings. But instead, they start focusing on the destruction of cultural heritage, that start understanding the specific value that this has in the Western media. And for one of the reasons for that, I argue, is that it's almost an easy outrage. I mean, destroying a temple is going to create an outrage. On the other hand, it's not. It is something that is still very much publishable. It will not create the same outrage of someone being beheaded, but it's still, it'll trigger a reaction. But it's a reaction you can publish, so it's okay. And following another law, in the ISIS headlines, we find that, there's a killing of Khalid al-Assad, obviously, and then followed by the destruction of Palmyra that is going to keep bringing ISIS back in the news. And, so that ISIS eventually, through destruction of cultural heritage, gets the attention it deserves. So that's the Google trend, but what we find out, there's another one, okay. It's a lot of the media actually started sort of using those unfiltered pictures on the social media feeds just to attract to websites, and several organizations chose not to do it, which was definitely commendable. But what we find out is on the ground there is definitely a connection between media attention and strategy and destruction of cultural heritage. And there's a ASOR Cultural Heritage Initiative report. There's basically, it's a group that's been doing a lot of work on the ground to report destruction of cultural heritage. And really good and really thorough work, and they've interviewed quite a lot of people. What they find out is that their sources inside Syria claim to have overheard ISIL commanders comment that attacking ancient monuments make the whole world talk about them. And ISIS is going to capitalize on that. I mean, there's the destruction of Palmyra has a very nice spot reserved in the publication of Dabik after the summer of 2015. And those, we find those really nicely staged pictures of barrels of explosive, of people just knotting threads together, and then eventually the explosion, which is the one that we'll find in our newsfeed the morning after. The issue here is that this is extremely detrimental to various extent. It is detrimental to, I want to say, perception of Islam in general, right? I'm going back here to, I don't know if you had a chance, I mean, it was the first for me, but to read Real Bad Arabs here, which is a really interesting book. But what happens is, despite the voice of Muslim community leaders condemning the destruction, we ended up seeing those destruction as something almost coherent with what we've previously seen in Bamiyan or in Timbuktu. So this was just the choice to publish those, and especially in a way that was not sort of critical of the context of their production, has been extremely detrimental to the perception of Islam in general in Western society. It's also been extremely detrimental to cultural heritage. What we see here in Dante's article, Michael Dante is the president of ASOR, by the way, is that deliberate destruction of cultural heritage, and only part of it is actually what we've been publishing, iconoclasm-related stuff, is fifth in the line of destruction, and we see that looting is actually much more important. So, since this is not the main cause of cultural heritage destruction, but it is still the most represented, because it is an easy target, what happens is that we start focusing on the wrong issue sometimes. And Palmyra was looted before, during, and after ISIS presence. But before, because we're not talking about it enough, because we focus on those, rather easy targets, we're not addressing the problem properly. And what we found is two opinions basically in the expert world with a whole range of behaviors between the two. One rather extreme, which is that press and media are to blame because ISIS wants to draw attention to itself by destroying this. So by publishing it, we basically play the game of ISIS. And the other one being that journalists need to work and have a critical approach to those sources, to publish, to being aware of the context of production of what they publish, and that we cannot change our practices in the face of terror. There have been some pretty good work done, actually. Quality investigative journalism. The Washington Post did a series on propaganda. I don't know if you saw it, but it was really good. One of their part actually addressing the question of ISIS's propaganda. BuzzFeed actually had a very good investigative approach to the looting problems in Syria. We also see a use of social media, but also crowdsourcing for fact-checking. We talked about Bellingcat yesterday a little bit. There's here The Guardian reporting the killings. There's more or less, I mean, not the exact equivalent, but there's a crowdsourcing effort. It's called Antiquarium, to try to track looted artifacts. There's also some work to be done in both communities actually. They need to improve understanding of connections between Islam and cultural heritage, which hasn't really been addressed properly. This is kind of a plug for the NGO that I work for, that I volunteer for. We're working with Save Muslim Heritage on creating programs with imams inside Syria to address connections between international humanitarian law, Syrian law, and Islamic law. What we do is we also talk about this, helps us clarify this kind of relationship in all of its diversity. And then what we want to do is we want to talk about it to a Western audience to make sure that at least we can express the whole complexity of that relationship. And yeah, so it's a picture I keep for the end. It's actually pretty relevant for the beginning. It's one of the earliest pictures in ISIS media history. I don't know if you know it. It comes from a video of a bulldozer that flattens a wall that was marking the border between Iraq and Syria. They present it as the collapse of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So to some extent, this is kind of the first case of iconoclasm carried out by ISIS. So what we found is, so to take a step back to look at the results, the iconoclasm and clickbait are a good fit. So this has really led to a change in our perception of those iconoclastic events, so that we put aside the fact that those are not necessarily representative, neither of the behavior of Islam towards cultural heritage, nor of the general destruction of cultural heritage in Syria. It doesn't mean they shouldn't be taken into account. They were taken seriously. ISIS is trying to send a powerful message through those events, and actually now they have actually calmed down over the past few months, so this is not as relevant. But need to keep in mind that bias is detrimental not only to Muslim and non-Muslim communities, but also to cultural heritage. So most importantly, it's a timely reflection as we are now getting always closer to connecting human rights and cultural heritage. So now is the time to debunk the sort of shortcuts, and this can be done by empowering the local communities, educating the communities, both in Syria and Europe, and to further inter-community dialogue. So this really helps developing some empathy, but also a critical sense, so that when you address even the best investigative journalism, you can still approach it from a critical perspective, which is a clear necessity for people to make up their own mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we've been exposed to 3 really diverse but very engaging and provocative papers. So I'd really like to open it up for questions. I'm sure you've got lots of things you'd like to ask each of our speakers. So could I ask you to introduce yourself and then pose your question, please?
Okay, my name is Yasmin Amin. I'm a PhD student at Exeter, and my question goes to Bastien, because I was following this cultural destruction thing, and I was always very hopeful when I read an article that they captured some kind of container which was full of smuggled statues, which were presumably destroyed in Mosul Museum or wherever. So apparently that there is an illegal trade going on, and this cultural destruction is more or less a smoke screen. So how true is that, and
well,
do they get destroyed or illegally traded or both, or? That's
a super smoky screen if that's the case. It's so looting happens. There's been so many fantasies about the amount of money that ISIS gathered. First, looting takes place in government areas, in opposition areas, in Daesh areas. And second, destruction through looting is big, it's massive, but destruction through collateral damage, through urban development is also extremely important. So those things do happen. The fact, one of the arguments was that ISIS was destroying Colombia just to focus the attention on something else than looting. It could be the case, but it could make sense, but it's probably not just the only reason why. The same way they destruction is not just for media attention. There's also still some political or religious agenda behind. But I mean, the question of looting is complex. But no, there's actual destruction taking place on a very large scale. Looting is part of.
Part of it.
Yeah, part of it. I'm
sorry. So we have a question in the middle and then at the back. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for 3 really very inspiring talks. I would like to ask Rebecca, this contemporary use of Suyuti, doesn't it date back somewhat earlier than that revolutionary period? Didn't the Mufti and Goma do it already in the early 2000s? And was he the first one to employ Suyuti specifically in this way? Or does it have a longer tradition? And is it related to Suyuti's response to Ibn Kathir and other people who had come just before him?
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, it does have a longer tradition. Excuse me. The only reason why I chose to focus on that particular period is because that's when the commentaries were published on YouTube, and so just connecting it to political events of the time. But yes, this is a figure from Islamic history, Islamic legal history, that has been very popular with Al-Azhar for a long time. And there are, of course, as you know, many reasons for that. In fact, that was actually one of the reasons why I chose to work on Suyuti in the first place, was that I knew that there was this connection, and that people like Sheikh Ali Goma, like some of his proteges, had been interested in Suyuti for quite a while. And so when I was looking for a figure to study, I actually did have that in mind as well. So, and as to, you're alluding to some of the reasons as to why someone like Suyuti might be kind of interesting. I think some of it has to do with this perception of him as a kind of, mujtahid, mujaddid type, that one can use his articulation of those concepts to speak to other ideas about reform and renewal and things like that, even though, it might be a stretch to say that he himself was this really big renewer or reformist or something like that. And yet, his ideas were very inspiring to other people who wanted to use them for their own projects of reform. So I think maybe that's one of the main reasons. But then also, I think one thing that I found really interesting, the decision to focus on figures from kind of the post-formative era of Islamic law. And this, in a way, connects back to the presentation we heard earlier about ISIS and their use of Islamic texts. So yes, of course, these more Salafi-oriented groups do draw on the later legal heritage, but selectively. And so it's kind of like a battle of different legal scholars from history. And so people who choose to hold up somebody like Suyuti are not necessarily the same type of scholars who would choose to emphasize someone like Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Kathir, etc. So I find that very interesting as a way of using people from the past to position yourself in the present.
Thank you, Rebecca. We have a question at the back.
Thank you. Nicholas Muller, question for Bastien. Coming to your last slide, empower and educate individuals, and we're talking about areas where there are conflict-affected areas where people are disempowered and suffering from all sorts of other issues, including just staying alive. Can you give us any practical examples of successful initiatives like that give us a flame of hope about what could be done and that are very practical?
Yeah. First, nice to meet you, finally. And second, it is very challenging. Obviously, there are... so most of the programs that have taken place over the past 5 years, let's say, were really focused in the Aleppo and Idlib area. And there's something which is carried out by the group of the psychologist Shakaraj who works in the Idlib area. What they've been doing there is on top of just damage assessment, which is really sort of the main activity of most heritage experts. But now we're trying to go beyond that. On top of that, they've been carrying out an outreach project where they talk about the rich diversity of cultural heritage. They organize an outreach program with kids, and they just go and visit archaeological sites where they have small-scale excavations, for instance. So that's one. This program, the shelter program that we're doing, what we're doing is, we also work in the Idlib area, but we send a whole bunch of questionnaires to imams and lawyers and experts working in Islamic courts in that area. And we organizing early 2017, we have this workshop that takes place at the border between Syria and Turkey, where we're providing all the information needed to be able to deal with those cultural heritage destruction cases in their court. So that's two. You'll find more like ad hoc programs like that, situations is changing so much that a lot of the projects that I've heard of fell through eventually. But those are at least two examples.
Thank you. So we have a question at the front and then a question down the back. Thank you very much.
Reem Habazi from Syria, journalist. So you talk a little bit about ISIS and what they did in Iraq and in Syria. So what I heard from people from Palmyra, and also my friend, she's a journalist. She made a documentary about Palmyra just after ISIS come.
Yeah.
So what she said from people, and a lot of interview, and some of them offline, they don't want to talk. Like everybody that the government, it was, I think, they know that they are coming to Palmyra.
Mm-hmm.
And they already took a lot of artifacts to Damascus to protect it. So they already knew about that in somehow. Yeah. And what ISIS done in Palmyra is not so much comparing with Iraq. They didn't destroy it. and they try to insult the place by by doing the execution, killing people in the same theater where they used to be used in history for like a theater, you know.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like the government, she tried to make the same scene. Like after they gone, they make a concert and musical concert in Palmyra to show to the people, look, this is ISIS and this is us. You know, it's like a kind of also a broadcasting for the government. And what do you prefer to choose?
So I'm going to try to stay like more or less neutral here, except with your Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But well, not yours actually, it's countries.
Not mine. No. We don't have one really.
Now, Palmyra is an interesting case because it's so powerful that it's been used in every situation by every government. The concert in the theater was just such an obvious move to just to sort of emphasize the gap between, well, this is on the same stage that you saw those mass killings. Now we're having a concert, to go back to the museum, a lot of the artifacts from the Palmyra museums were taken to a bank, a safe in Damascus. A lot of them, we don't know how much, but the son of Khalid al-Assad actually was working on that. And the story says that they were leaving with the last truck as Daesh was arriving at the place. And so that's the story. In reality, we don't really know how much of it was moved. We know there was still some artifacts coming from the Palmyra museums and ended up in the international markets. So we know that yes, Daesh destroyed some architectural and cultural features of the sites, but most of the heritage experts said that things weren't as bad as we thought. The first thing they said when they entered the site was that. What we know also is that the shelling that took place in the days before did hit here and there a few cultural elements, a shelling of the,
But what make me a little bit confused, or maybe like ask why all this is broadcasting about ISIS? Like we have a free army, or let's say a lot of opposition groups who works against the government. They took the places like in Aleppo Citadel, in Al-Husn, places which is very historical, and nobody do broadcasting about these places that is being damaged.
And you're right.
Because of the war.
Well, ISIS is great because we can focus on them and say, well, you're responsible for all the cultural heritage destruction, so that we don't really have to say, well, this is what the official army is destroying, and this is what the Free Syrian Army or armies is destroying. So that's one of the reasons why we focus on this type of destruction. They're more easy, they're less political. But you're right, destructions have taken place because of literally everyone involved in the conflict.
So we might take this discussion offline because I know there's other questions. There are other questions. So down the back and then at the front. Thank you.
So mine is not a question, it's a very short comment. I'm Simonetta Calderini from University of Roehampton, Islamic Studies. It was just referring back to your slide on taken from Davik of the young man, long beard, fatigue, Kalashnikov, and the little kitten.
Yeah.
Just to emphasize a little bit more about interpretation. This is a matter of scope, agendas. It's a matter of contextualization, and it's a matter of course, propaganda, and audience, obviously. And just to make a comment about the fact that Davik is the online magazine. It is in English, it is in Arabic, etc., etc. And of course, it's a very powerful propaganda tool to recruit young women from the West and from the Gulf. Now, for a Gulf woman or Muslim young women, that has got a significance. That is, of course, a young man, attractive, you are in your teens, but it's also linked to the hadith of the Prophet, whereby the favorite pet of the Prophet were cats. Was a cat. Obviously, can't be a dog because of cultural association with the dirt, etc. Now, for a Western potential recruit, a young teenage woman, that is, the cute. You mentioned the term cute. So just a little bit more about the audience, the context, and the perspective.
And I think that's a really good point.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's taking you in a different direction slightly.
No, but it's really
great
good.
Point.
Thank you.
So
yeah,
thank
it's
you.
fascinating.
So, your question, please.
Very quick questions. One to Rebecca and a comment for Kimani. Rebecca, Suyuti's commentary on YouTube, we just said that people use these past figures in order to explain the present, and we just talked about so there is also the Ibn Taymiyyah's group as well. Do these two groups then have debates on YouTube?
Not explicitly, maybe, but well, I mean, there's a lot of overlap, of course. You know, some of the people who use one will use the other, but then it's just what you choose to emphasize. You know, so they are drawing somebody like Suyuti back into a kind of picture of, you know, what does our manhaj look like? You know, and so for them, it's really about, well, they've looked at as a religious establishment, what do we have to offer today? And they focused on, well, we have our manhaj. That's what, you know. And so then you look for people in the heritage of Islamic jurisprudence who really do kind of help to speak to that manhaj. And Suyuti is one of those people for sure. Ibn Taymiyyah could be used in some regards as well in that same project. However, you know, for my own research, I just find it remarkable that all of these people at this particular moment just had a big interest in broadcasting Suyuti to the Egyptian public, you know. So, not that they hadn't been doing that before, but that it suddenly became an interest such that you would do a 14-session commentary on that particular text at that moment. So.
And my comment on Kimani, he started by saying that there's been a lot of Egypt in this conference, and I'm afraid I want to add a little bit of it to your, as a footnote to your talk, and that is one of the very influential radios broadcasts in East Africa has been Radio Cairo. So you have, that is the one which actually then aided the political agitation right through from the 50s to the 60s, and now it has become almost a rival to Radio Tehran. So you have that sort of relationship.
Absolutely. I mean, it was especially in the 1950s, extremely important Radio Cairo for the liberation struggle and also for the liberation of Southern Africa. So absolutely right on cue, especially the Kiswahili broadcasts.
Fantastic. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I have just one question for Bastien. So when you said it's probably I didn't get it, or you said it and I didn't get it, but it's just like to clarify. So some of these very precious cultural heritage items, some of them were destroyed, others were or are sold in the international market. So not to point fingers on who is responsible, but how could you trace the line of responsibility when it's out of the hands of ISIS and in the international market? You can't really trace the international market. And who does it involve? Like which countries and like what could be done in that case?
I want to take the next hour to reply to this. But just shortly, the responsibilities is I think that's almost a legal and philosophical question, but tracing the artifacts is pretty difficult. What we find a lot in context of conflict is that artifacts will be, they get out of the country very quickly originally for the early time of the conflict, and then 2 years in the conflict, into the conflict, you'll see people storing them, so that it gets, they'll come out of their storage in probably 10 years and just sort of get back into the international market. But so it is extremely difficult. We've found things here and there. There's been a lot of training done with sort of a custom police in Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. But we know a lot has been lost anyway. However, we also know a lot has been sold as sort of original, real antiquities when they were actually a massive amount of fake antiquity productions. So it is difficult. I think there's not enough international collaboration on that topic, and there's not enough. Now, increasingly, and the USA have been doing a good job at this, they're implementing laws to forbid purchase of anything coming from Syria or any antiquity coming from Syria and Iraq. But this is not the case in every country. So you need to cut the demand, basically, and one of the ways to do that is by, those things go to the countries of the Gulf, to Western countries. We know that Switzerland plays a big role in redistributing those artifacts. We know that Germany does as well. So you just need to cut the demand. You cannot blame the guy who's going to excavate in his backyard and try to sell something because he has nothing else to eat. Right? You can blame is the people pay for everything.
So do we have any other questions?
I had one actually.
Good.
I was wondering how how do those Islamic-inspired radio fund themselves? Where did the money come from?
Well, two of them are owned by fairly rich individuals, but they also get quite a bit from Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
We know that the Iqra FM survives on donations through the Supreme Council of Kenya Muslims. In the initial stages, they got quite a bit from Sudan, some support from Sudan, as well as really Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states. So, but they also work actually with very low salaries, frankly. I know there was a strike organized within Iqra about a year ago because of salaries. So, very, very poor salaries.
Well, look, thank you very much. I'd like to say thank you to all of our panellists. I think we've had 3 really wonderful papers, so let's share it. I invite you to come next door so we can have the concluding